Let me be very clear about something. This summit is not about chemistry, and it is not about stagecraft. Honestly, leaders do not sit down at this level because they suddenly feel warm toward each other. They meet when the relationship is under strain, when the margin for maneuver is narrowing, and when each side needs to test whether the other is still reachable through pressure, not sentiment. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the televised ceremony is designed to hide. The easy story is always the same: handshake, smile, careful language photographs. That is what the public sees because it is what the public is meant to see. But the real purpose of a summit like this is not performance. It is leverage. It is a controlled attempt to freeze one line of conflict, buy time on another, and signal to every observer that escalation is being managed by adults who still believe they can shape the board. That is what a summit is when the underlying relationship is already stressed. It is a signaling event aimed at markets, allies, and domestic audiences. The real content lives underneath the optics. What each side wants is not symmetry. One side wants predictability. The other wants concessions. One side wants to prevent further deterioration in trade, technology, and military signaling. The other wants to extract relief without paying a strategic price. That is the basic structure. Everything else is decoration. The domestic context matters because neither leader walks in with unlimited freedom. Both are constrained by internal political coalitions, industrial interests, security bureaucracies, and a public that has already absorbed years of hardening language. A leader can soften tone for the camera, but he cannot erase the bureaucracy that wrote the restrictions, or the legislative pressure that forced the restrictions, or the strategic mistrust that made them politically durable in the first place. That is why these meetings so often produce language that sounds constructive while leaving the core dispute untouched. The space for a real deal is narrower than the room suggests. Look at the bargaining structure. Tariffs are not just tariffs. They are domestic protection, fiscal leverage, and negotiating theater all at once. Export controls are not just technical limits. They are a deliberate attempt to slow capability transfer in sectors that decide the next decade of power. Supply chains are not just logistics. They are strategic dependencies being reorganized in real time. Taiwan is not a side issue. It is the central stress test for deterrence, credibility, and alliance cohesion in the Indo-Pacific. And alliance pressure is not a separate file. It is part of the same architecture because every move in this relationship is read simultaneously in Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, Brussels, and Washington. That is why the summit matters, even if it produces almost nothing on paper. The value is in the signaling. If the markets believe tension is being contained, capital breathes easier. If allies believe the channel remains open, they delay hedging in more dangerous directions. If domestic audiences believe the leader is being tough but responsible, political costs can be managed for another cycle. But if the meeting reveals that the sides are still locked into incompatible demands, then the summit becomes less a breakthrough than a measurement instrument. It tells you how wide the gap really is, and the gap is wide. On one side is the desire to stabilize the relationship without surrendering leverage on advanced technology, maritime posture, or coercive tools. On the other side is the desire to reduce the temperature while forcing the other party to ease tariffs, relax controls, or at least stop tightening the noose around high-end supply chains. Neither side trusts the other to honor a broad political promise if the strategic environment changes. That is why the deal space is constrained. The mistrust is not rhetorical. It is institutionalized. Most people stop here, and that is exactly why they miss what I am about to explain next. The most important part of the summit is not whether a statement sounds friendly. It is whether the follow-through changes the operational environment. Does the tariff structure shift? Do the export controls soften? Do the military channels deconflict more reliably? Do the alliance consultations become more coordinated? If none of that changes, then the summit was not a reset. It was a pause. The possible outcomes are limited. A managed thaw is possible, where both sides reduce the temperature just enough to avoid immediate escalation. A symbolic reset is possible where the language improves, but the substantive disputes remain intact. A failed summit is also possible where the optics collapse under the weight of unresolved contradiction. The one outcome that matters least is the one most often celebrated in public, a polished handshake with no durable change in the underlying pressure. That is why the first thing to understand is not the ceremony, but the pressure each leader brings into the room. The summit begins long before the handshake in the domestic cost that made the meeting necessary. The handshake is public, but the bargaining position is built far away from the camera, in the pressures each leader cannot ignore at home. That is where the summit really begins. It is not a diplomatic performance first. It is a power negotiation under constraint. For Washington, the calendar is always political. Election cycles compress strategic patience. Inflation turns every supply chain decision into a domestic argument, and industrial policy now sits inside a larger contest over jobs, prices, and credibility. The White House has to show toughness toward Beijing without turning that toughness into higher consumer costs, weaker corporate margins, or a new round of market volatility. That is a narrow lane, too soft, and it looks like strategic drift. Too hard, and business starts screaming, farmers start counting losses, and the industrial base that Washington says it wants to rebuild gets caught in the crossfire. That is why the American delegation is not negotiating from pure confidence. It is negotiating from a need to manage contradictions. Congress wants punishment. Industry wants predictability. Allies want reassurance. The bureaucracy wants control over escalation. And the president needs a result that can be described as strength without forcing the economy to absorb the full cost of confrontation. The real objective is not just to pressure Beijing. It is to keep the domestic coalition behind containment from breaking apart under its own weight. Beijing is operating under a different but equally severe set of pressures. Growth has slowed. The property sector is still absorbing damage. Local government finances remain strained. Youth employment is politically sensitive, and technology bottlenecks have turned export controls into a direct national security problem. The leadership cannot afford the image of strategic weakness, but it also cannot afford a full rupture with the United States, because rupture would intensify every internal pressure already moving in the wrong direction. So Beijing is trying to extract breathing room, not surrender. It wants time. It wants access. It wants predictability in trade and technology flows. Above all, it wants to preserve regime confidence inside a difficult economic environment. That is the hidden symmetry. Both sides need the meeting because both sides are under pressure. Washington wants leverage without recessionary consequences. Beijing wants relief without looking cornered. Neither delegation arrives from a position of simple strength. They arrive with vulnerabilities that shape every sentence they are willing to utter. That is why the agenda is never just the agenda. The public talks are about stability, communication, and managed competition. The real conversation is about tariffs that distort supply chains, export controls that slow technological upgrading, semiconductor restrictions that target advanced manufacturing, and alliance pressure designed to force other states into tighter alignment with Washington. Taiwan remains the sharpest signal in the room because it is where military deterrence, political identity, and alliance credibility all converge. One side wants to deter miscalculation. The other wants to prevent strategic encirclement. Neither side trusts the other's definition of restraint. Most people watch for the photo opportunity and then move on. That is a mistake. The optics matter less than the follow-through because the summit is not the event. The event is what each side takes back into its own system and whether it can be translated into policy without triggering internal resistance. A statement about communication is easy. A tariff pause is harder. A licensing change on advanced chips is harder still. A shift in alliance posture or Taiwan signaling is harder again. That is where the actual test begins. What this meeting reveals is simple. Great power competition is no longer being driven only by external ambition. It is being driven by internal fragility. The domestic economy, the political calendar, the industrial base, and the confidence of the state itself are now part of the battlefield. The summit is useful only if it buys time, narrows miscalculation, or opens a corridor for bargaining on the hard issues that both sides would rather postpone. And once domestic pressure sets the ceiling, the next layer is the actual list of demands. The summit is only meaningful if it can move the hard issues that have been frozen for years. Once the political pressure is clear, the summit becomes a transaction. What can be traded, what can be delayed, and what can never be surrendered. Let me be very clear about something. This is not a friendship summit. It is a controlled power negotiation, and both sides are entering it with a ledger, not a handshake. The public language will be all about stability, dialogue, and responsible management. That is the performance. The real meeting is about leverage. Washington wants to know whether selective tariff relief can be exchanged for measurable restraint on trade retaliation, industrial policy, and strategic coercion. Beijing wants to know whether limited concessions on purchases, market access, or enforcement language can buy breathing room on export controls, technology restrictions, and alliance pressure. Neither side is trying to solve the relationship. They are trying to define the next margin of contest. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the mainstream conversation is entirely missing. Tariffs are the easiest item to talk about and the hardest to settle. They are visible, politically legible, and easy to weaponize at home. A tariff can be announced in one speech and rescinded in another, which makes it ideal for optics. But the real question is not whether some rates move from 25% to 15%, or whether a narrow list of consumer goods gets temporary relief. The real question is whether either side is willing to accept an enforceable structure that changes behavior. That is where these talks usually break down. Symbolic concessions are cheap, compliance is expensive, export controls are more serious. Semiconductors, advanced lithography tools, high-end chip design software, precision manufacturing equipment, and the supply chain nodes around them are not bargaining chips in the normal sense. They are the architecture of future power. If Washington eases pressure there, it is not because trust has been restored. It is because the United States has decided that the cost of full decoupling is too high in one specific lane. If Beijing offers restraint, it is not because it has accepted the logic of the controls. It is because it wants time. Time to localize, substitute, reroute, and reduce exposure. That is the hidden agenda on both sides. Not reconciliation. Time, the semiconductor issue, is especially blunt. This is about who can still produce leading-edge chips, who can still acquire the equipment to make them, and who can still keep advanced manufacturing ecosystems connected across borders. Once a control regime is built around 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, chip-making tools, and design access, the meeting is no longer about abstract trade friction. It is about whether the United States keeps a choke point on the highest value layers of the industrial stack, and whether China can fragment that choke point before it hardens into a permanent barrier. Rare earths sit in the same category, but from the other direction. Beijing knows the world is not easily reorganized away from its refining and processing capacity. Washington knows that dependence on that bottleneck is a strategic vulnerability. So the summit becomes a probe. Can rare earth flows be kept stable in exchange for partial tariff relief or narrower sanctions pressure? Can Beijing signal predictability without surrendering the option to tighten exports later if the pressure rises? Again, the issue is not friendship, it is controlled exposure. Agricultural trade is the cleaner political item, which is exactly why it gets used as a signaling device. Soybeans, corn, pork, and other farm exports can be purchased in volumes large enough to produce headlines, but small enough to preserve flexibility. A pledge to buy more grain is easy to announce. It does not necessarily change the strategic balance, but it can buy silence in a critical constituency, soften political resistance, and create the appearance of progress. That is why agricultural commitments often appear in these meetings. They are low friction, high visibility, and rarely decisive. Financial de-risking is quieter and more consequential. It means reducing exposure to sanctions, payment disruption, capital controls, and regulatory entanglement. It means figuring out how much cross-border financial plumbing can remain intact when strategic mistrust is rising. This is where the meeting intersects with the next phase of great power competition. If either side believes the other is preparing for escalation, the first move is not necessarily military. It is financial insulation. Diversify settlement mechanisms, reduce dollar exposure, harden domestic payment channels. Test third country conduits. That process is already underway, and the summit can slow it at the margins, but it cannot reverse it. The deal space is narrow because domestic politics are narrow. In Washington, any concession on tariffs or technology controls will be attacked as weakness unless it can be sold as securing enforceable gains. In Beijing, any visible retreat under American pressure risks looking like submission, which is politically corrosive in a system that has spent years framing resilience as sovereignty. Both leaderships therefore need a result that can be narrated as strength. That is why the language matters less than the follow-through. A warm statement means nothing if the enforcement machinery stays in place. A cold statement means little if back-channel implementation creates practical relief. And then there is Taiwan. It is always there, even when nobody says it aloud. The signaling around Taiwan is part of the summit, whether it appears on the final communique or not. The United States wants restraint in the surrounding military and diplomatic environment. China wants any American language that implies deterrence or support to soften. Neither side expects the other to abandon its core position. What each side wants is a limit on escalation language, a pause in visible signaling, and enough ambiguity to avoid immediate crisis. That is not resolution. That is managed confrontation. Alliance pressure matters for the same reason. Washington is not negotiating with Beijing in a vacuum. It is negotiating with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Europe, and domestic industries that all have interests in the outcome. Beijing is negotiating while watching how pressure on China affects the behavior of Southeast Asia, the Gulf, Africa, and Latin America. Every signal is observed beyond the room. Every phrase is tested against wider strategic alignment. That is why a summit can look calm and still be significant. The optics matter because they shape how third parties price risk. So the likely outcomes are limited, but not meaningless. There may be selective tariff pauses, narrowed export control language, renewed agricultural purchases, a mechanism for deconfliction, and carefully worded commitments to keep channels open. That is the outer layer. The deeper layer is whether either side leaves believing the other is prepared to enforce a more durable separation if necessary. If the answer is yes, then the summit is not a reset. It is a reconnaissance contact before the next phase. What this meeting really reveals is that the contest has moved beyond symbolic confrontation. The bargaining is now about which parts of the system remain connected, which parts are hardened, and which dependencies can still be used as pressure points. That struggle does not stay inside customs rules or export licenses. It expands into the architecture of power around both countries, where alliances and security commitments shape every possible deal. No great power summit happens in a vacuum. Every word is heard by allies, rivals, and markets that are already pricing the next move. And that is the first thing to understand here. This is not a diplomatic performance. It is a power negotiation conducted under regional surveillance. Washington does not walk into these meetings alone because its leverage is already distributed across an alliance network that stretches from Tokyo to Brussels, from New Delhi to ASEAN capitals, watching the horizon line for the next crisis. Japan matters because it sits on the logistical spine of American forward power in the Western Pacific, and because Tokyo's own threat perception has hardened around Taiwan, the East China Sea, and the missile envelope now covering the region. Europe matters because sanctions discipline, export control alignment, and technology screening are no longer abstract policy tools. They are part of the larger coercive architecture. India matters because it is the swing power that neither side can ignore, a country that wants strategic autonomy but still calibrates its posture against Chinese pressure on the border, in the Indian Ocean, and through supply chain competition. ASEAN matters because it is where the gap between naval signaling and political control becomes visible. The Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia all read the same map differently, but none of them can pretend that the South China Sea is insulated from the broader U.S.-China contest. That is why the summit is never just about the two leaders in the room. It is about what each side can promise to friends and what each side must signal to adversaries. Washington wants to show that it can manage competition without collapsing deterrence. Beijing wants to show that it can engage without conceding strategic momentum. Both sides need the meeting, but for different reasons. The United States needs proof that crisis management still exists, that military-to-military channels can reduce the chance of an accident around Taiwan or the South China Sea, and that allies will not interpret every confrontation as a sign of drift. China needs space. It needs breathing room against tariffs, export controls, semiconductor restrictions, and the slow tightening of a coalition that is not formal in the old treaty sense, but is functionally real enough to shape industrial outcomes. The hidden agenda is always the same. Tariffs are never just tariffs. Export controls are never just export controls. Supply chains are the battlefield beneath the battlefield. Washington is trying to limit China's access to advanced chips, lithography tools, high-end AI accelerators, and dual-use components that feed both civilian industry and military modernization. Beijing is trying to prevent the strategic decoupling from becoming irreversible. That means the summit is as much about a de-escalation pause as it is about any public statement each side is trying to extract time. Washington wants time to deepen allied coordination and harden industrial capacity. Beijing wants time to absorb pressure, reroute trade, and reduce the shock of technology denial. Taiwan sits at the center of the geometry. Every statement about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is heard in Taipei, Tokyo, Manila, and Canberra as a signal of whether deterrence is holding. Every military exercise near the island, every bomber transit, every naval passage, every language shift in an official communique is read against the same question. Is this a managed rivalry or a transition toward a more dangerous phase? The South China Sea plays the same role. It is not only a maritime dispute. It is a test of whether China can normalize coercive presence, whether the United States can sustain freedom of navigation operations without overcommitting, and whether regional states believe American assurances are backed by actual capacity. This is why domestic politics constrain the deal space so severely. Neither leader can come home looking weak.